Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tao. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Sounding Board, a leader transformation platform providing coaching and mentoring. And welcome to Leadership Live. It's our series where we profile and get to chat with some incredible leaders in the learning, HR, the people and culture space. And today we are actually doing something a little bit different. I have a really exciting guest, Priya Fielding-Singh. She is the Senior Manager of Research, Education, and Editorial at Lean In, and the co-author of a report that I'm sure a lot of you have read, the Women in the Workplace report, which is a collaboration between Lean In and McKinsey, and one of the largest studies on the state of women in corporate America. And given how much, leadership, which is a topic we cover a lot here, Priya, talks about how that impacts all of the sort of women, underrepresented leaders in the workplace. We thought this would be a really fascinating topic for our audience. So thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Christine. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. Well, look, I know that we've got a lot we want to cover, but a big theme for this series is that we also love to just get to know you a little bit as a person before we start to dive into the work. And so our first question is always the same, but we like to know, what is your origin story?
Yeah, I love that question. So if there's one thread running through my entire professional path or career, it's really a drive to understand and address inequality. The seeds of this interest in inequality were sown when I was really young, in childhood. So when I was 9 years old, my family became a foster family. And so for most of my childhood, I lived alongside, shared rooms, shared meals with my foster siblings who had come from really difficult and disadvantaged backgrounds. So growing up, I had this really intimate exposure to inequality, to topics of poverty and privilege and power. And I always felt this internal drive to understand the roots of these broader inequalities and how also they were reproduced over time. And so that compelled me in college to study education and social policy to understand how policies and programs played a role in this, and ultimately led me to do a PhD in sociology so that I could use data and evidence to better understand what I had seen with my own eyes as a child. Within this broader interest in inequality, I was always really attuned to gender inequality.
Yeah.
Even from a really young age, I just saw it everywhere, from the gendered expectations within my own family that prevented my mother from pursuing a career that she was capable of and wanted to pursue, to how I saw my teachers treat boys and girls differently, or the ways that I saw that my foster sisters were often the ones who had experienced sexual violence in their childhoods. And, I even remember sitting in front of the TV, watching the news with my parents in the 90s, seeing the news on Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, and thinking at like a really young age, like, I feel like the way this woman's being portrayed isn't quite right. So I guess you could say that, like, I always had this really intuitive radar for the ways that
Yeah.
gender shaped people's life chances. And so kind of I followed that radar, and I built a career over the course of a decade as a sociologist, as a professor who studied the hidden ways that gender impacts our lives. And I focused a lot on gender and health. I wrote a book looking at the role of gender in caregiving in driving nutritional and health inequalities in the United States. And I wrote on these topics for outlets like the Washington Post and the LA Times and HBR. And I love that career in so many ways. And I kept running up against this fundamental tension, which is that I always wanted to be writing about and working with broader audiences on these issues. I
Mm.
valued so much about academia, about writing for scientific audiences in scientific journals, and I always wanted to feel closer to the impact. And so that led me ultimately to make a mid-career pivot out of academia and into the foundation space, and into the current role that I'm in, working in research and education at Lean In, where I get to keep doing the research that I love, but I get to write it for and share it directly with the public, with our community, and as in addition to that, with companies, right? So that we can help them make workplaces fairer for women and for everyone. And so I've co-authored two of the most recent Women in the Workplace reports, our 2023 report, this year's 10th anniversary report, as well as a really fantastic and important report that we did earlier this year on the state of Latinas in corporate America. And for the Women in the Workplace report, as you know, we have over the last decade surveyed more than 1,000 companies. We've surveyed nearly 500,000 employees. And so I'm really excited today to have the chance to share with you a bit about what we learned. For this most recent report, we did this longitudinal look back over the last 10 years to see what's gotten better, what's gotten worse, and what stayed the same for women at work. So I'm looking forward to diving into those findings with you.
Well, and I think, the last 10 years have been such an incredible 10 years in this space. Even the sort of appetite and shifts and trends driving, particularly even awareness, right, of the importance of this within the workplace. Certainly, we saw it ourselves and at Sounding Board because a lot of the companies we work with are thinking about leader development as an approach to addressing some of the inequity that they saw. But I am like fascinated. What were some of those top findings, especially given that you looked back over the last 10 years, even from how that's evolved over time and maybe what stayed the same or what's changed and what's different?
Yeah. So if I were to boil our top findings down into two headlines, I would say headline one, there has been real meaningful progress for women in the workplace and for companies. And headline two, that progress is surprisingly fragile. So I'll dive a little bit into each of these headlines. So first headline, there's been real progress like at the highest level for both companies and women. There have been important gains in like three big areas. So first and most notably, there are more women in leadership today than there were 10 years ago. Today, 29% of C-suite leaders are women. That's up from 17% in 2015. And we at Lean In want to celebrate this progress, because we know from a lot of research that companies with more women in leadership benefit from greater innovation, they have healthier cultures, they have stronger performance, and also having women leaders inspires the next generation to make their mark. We know how important having role models and exemplars within one's own company, in the media, out in public is for actually showing women what they can achieve. Second thing that's been really good is there are better policies for employees. Obviously, most notably, and most obviously for, so many of us who work in the workplace today, workplace flexibility has grown significantly over the past decade, much of that accelerated by progress during the pandemic. Secondly, more companies today than ever are offering really critical benefits for employees, particularly those who are parents, caregivers, those facing health challenges. Nearly all companies now offer some form of parental leave, and other benefits have gone up as well, like paid sick leave and paid bereavement leaves. And the third area of progress is that there really has been an increased focus on fostering inclusion. Companies have worked over the past decade to set inclusion as a top priority with managers. And companies are doing more now to activate employees as agents of change. So, for example, nearly all companies now offer things like bias or allyship trainings. Okay, but headline two is
Yeah.
that a lot of these gains are actually really quite fragile. So when you drill a bit further down into the data, what we saw on our team was that the pipeline is not as healthy as those initial numbers suggest. So first, yes, there are more women in senior leadership today, but these gains in representation at the top have not been equally distributed, right? So only 7% of C-suite leaders today are women of color compared to 22% of white women. Progress at the C-suite also isn't sustainable. So what we found was that the way that companies were able to increase women's representation in the C-suite was by essentially adding what we call a staff role. So a staff role is a position in a function that supports an organization rather than having direct profit and loss responsibilities. So staff roles are often in places like human resources, legal, IT. So a C-suite staff position might be like a chief human resources officer. So what companies did is that they added a staff role to the C-suite and then they filled it with a woman. Now, we are excited that they have added roles and put women in them, but that's not a sustainable or viable path to parity because companies can't just keep adding new roles and filling them with women. They have to also shift the distribution of roles for women.
Right.
Another data point that speaks to the fragility of the gains for women is that a lot of women continue to face really significant barriers earlier in their careers. So first of all, women are getting left behind at the very beginning of the pipeline. They're less likely to be hired into the entry level. So women represent 59% of college graduates. As we know, women's educational attainment has really taken off over the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
They represent 51% of the population, but they only represent 48% of the entry level. And this has not really improved much over the last decade. Also, really importantly, women face a broken rung. This is a term that we coined and that we have written on for many years. They face this broken rung early in their careers at that first critical promotion up from the entry level to manager positions. And this is not improving over time. So 6 years ago in 2018, for every 100 men that were promoted to manager, just 79 women were promoted. And this year, just 81 women were promoted. So very little progress in that space. And really important, and we dive into this in the report in greater detail, the broken rung has gotten worse for Latinas and Black women. So all in all, we find that, and we write about this, quite extensively in the report, that even at the current rate of progress and assuming like a best case scenario, it will still take more than 20 years to reach parity for white women in senior leadership. And it'll take more than twice as long, so 48 years, nearly 50 years, half a century, to reach parity for all women. And that assumes that companies can translate what we see as quite precarious gains into more substantial and sustainable momentum. And for many of us, what that means quite literally is that we will not see parity for all women in our lifetimes. And that should really be a wake-up call for companies that the current pace of change and the current method of change is not going to get us where we need to go fast enough.
Yeah, well, certainly not my lifetime. And that's when you kind of looked at the data and, you highlighted some important things, both at the top as well as that kind of early career level, and this kind of fragility that you talk about. What do you think is contributing to that? Do you think the macro environment that we've been in has contributed to that? Like, were there any indications of things that were impacting or influencing that?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of factors at play, obviously. But one thing that's really clear to us looking over time at the data is that a key factor is companies' commitments and efforts to actually address these issues.
Yeah.
So if we look specifically at Black women, what we can see is in the years directly following George Floyd, when there was an increased focus on racial equity within the workplace, the broken rung for Black women improved significantly because
Yeah.
companies were actually doubling down on efforts to promote Black women to focus on their advancement. But the second that companies took their foot off the gas in the last 2 years, the broken rung has gone exactly back to where it was in 2019 for Black women. So this is like both a hopeful story because it shows that if companies actually care and work on this, they can do something. They can have pretty quick, substantial wins within a short period of time. But it also speaks to the fact that companies are not necessarily as enduringly and deeply committed, or at least not acting that way, so that we see these gains follow through over time.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that, both in the press and there's been a lot of press and discussion around like what happened to the chief diversity officer, right? And what happened to these gains that you're talking about. But I think that's a really important point, that it's almost like, in spite of what's happening around us, ultimately it comes down to a deep-rooted commitment to continue to do this work, from especially corporations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else that surprised you from the report that you think is worth sharing?
Yeah. Well, it almost seems a little bit naive now, knowing what I know. But I hoped going into this year's report that we would find that women were at least having a marginally better experience than they were 5 or 10 years ago. But that's not what we found at all. So we found across all different kinds of metrics, whether it was experiencing bias, microaggressions, sexual harassment, that women's day-to-day experiences actually look alarmingly similar to the past. and that women of color continue to have just an overall worse experience at work. So I'll dive into a few data points that really stood out to me because I think they highlight just how really grave the situation remains for women at work. So,
Yeah.
women are far more likely than men to deal with comments and actions that undermine their confidence and leadership abilities. They're still twice as likely as men to be mistaken for someone more junior, to be interrupted or spoken over. They're also far more likely to have their judgment questioned in their area of expertise. And women of color are far more likely to be on the receiving end of demeaning comments and experiences. So for Black women, they're 3 times as likely as other women for coworkers to express surprise at their language skills or ability. Black women and Asian women are 5 times more likely to be confused with someone of the same race or ethnicity.
Yeah.
Latinas are the most likely to feel judged because of their accent or how they speak. And LGBTQ women and women with disabilities are twice as likely to say that they can't talk about their life outside of work with their colleagues. Um, Really shockingly, we saw that at work sexual harassment is not getting any better despite a lot of needed attention brought to it over the last decade. So over a third of women have experienced some form of sexual harassment during their careers, pretty much the same as in 2018. And we were also struck to see that younger women who have much shorter tenures, right, were
Yeah.
just as likely as older women to have experienced some form of sexual harassment during the course of their career. So this is really concerning because obviously rooting out sexual harassment is absolutely fundamental to creating a workplace where women feel supported and respected. And then the last thing that I'd be like remiss not to mention is that we found that women still report facing really deep inequities at home. And we can't get to equality at work if we don't get to equality at home. So women with partners were still 4 times more likely than men to say that they do most or all of the housework. And it looked really similar to how it looked in 2018. And so, given all of this, it's really no surprise today that women are just as likely to say that their gender will hinder their career progression as they were 6 years ago. So, 1 in 4 women think that their gender is going to make it harder to advance. 1 in 3 say that their gender has already contributed to missed opportunities. And the story for women of color is even worse, with more reporting that their race has hurt their opportunities so far. The one thing that I will note that's like a point of resilience is that despite all this, like women remain really ambitious and just as ambitious as men. So 7 out of 10 women who we survey say that they want to get promoted to the next level. And younger women who actually see in a really clear-eyed way the challenges that lie ahead are even more ambitious. So those were
Mm.
some of the findings that really stood out to me and the rest of the team, and were, in some ways, overall a bit disappointing, but also again like another wake-up call that things are not just going to naturally improve, but companies really do need to double down on their efforts to improve and foster like inclusion within the workplace.
Man, well, what the heck, Priya? Because, I feel like, you and I sit in the middle of a lot of companies trying to do this work. And, like, in your own eyes, you've seen that there's been efforts that companies have made, right? Like you said, there's more benefits, there's more things that are being offered that are supposed to address this. But then if the data is telling us that that hasn't changed, like what changes have companies made that, you've seen that are actually having impact? And gosh, what do we do?
It's the big question, the important question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, the scorecard for companies is mixed. So I highlighted a couple of things that companies are doing really well, and I think in the area of work-life supports and policies and benefits, like I
Yeah.
think that's sort of an unambiguous win. Like most benefits have become more prevalent over time. Um, as I said, like almost every company offers a form of parental leave.
Yeah.
Half of companies now offer support for caregivers of sick or elderly adults. All the numbers are way up. Another thing that we've seen companies make some like real headway on is putting processes in place to make hiring and promotions more fair.
Mm.
So decades of social science research show that unconscious bias creeps into hiring, performance reviews, promotions decisions, and we've been urging companies for years to put research-backed measures into place to weed that bias out.
Yeah.
And the good news is that like many companies have done some of the things that we've been advising. So almost 7 in 10 now offer bias training for evaluators, and this is up over the last 6 years. Over half send bias reminders out to evaluators before these processes take place. But we do find that, it's not just integrating one practice that's going to make a process more fair. You have to integrate a number of processes to actually move the needle. And so, when we look at core practices that experts recommend for making these processes more fair, we found that fewer than 1 in 3 companies were doing all core recommended practices. And so there's clear evidence that companies need to be doing more. They need to be taking a really holistic approach to this. And we see that the broken rung remains broken, that women are less likely to be hired into entry level. So we have evidence that whatever efforts companies are making, notable as they are, there's still obviously more to be done, right? One other thing that we saw that was a bit disappointing was that we saw that fewer companies were investing in career development and sponsorship programs for women, programs that had content specifically for women or for women of color, even though we know that these kinds of programs can really be catalysts for women's growth and advancement. Companies are also offering fewer things that we know are really important, like recruiting programs for women or women of color, or internship programs. And we also saw that, interestingly, companies were setting inclusion and advancement as priorities with managers. But we found that few managers were actually delivering on those objectives. We suspect because managers are telling us that more and more is expected of them, their plates are getting fuller and fuller, and they don't necessarily have the time or the bandwidth to be able to focusing on these to be able to focus on these really key priorities that would help advance women and foster inclusion. And so, kind of given this mixed scorecard, I think we see that progress, we see the areas for development, and we, as a foundation and as a partnership with McKinsey, would like to be really optimistic that companies are going to keep doing more to improve work for women. But there's one big finding that we have from this year that's holding us back from that optimism, and that's that we saw that companies' commitments to gender and racial diversity are actually declining. They're down from 5 years ago. And so at exactly the moment when companies should really be doubling down on their efforts, and employees are needed even more for agents of change, there are early signs that companies' commitments are declining and employees' commitments to these issues are stagnating.
Yeah. And you're in these conversations with companies, right? And so do you have a sense of what's motivating that, or what's driving that decline, or what are the things that companies might be surfacing that they're saying is keeping them from being able to keep up that sustained commitment?
Mhm. Yeah, well, I mean, to be certain, changes to the legal landscape around diversity, equity, and inclusion are causing companies to take a pause, right? And think
Yeah.
about what they can actually be doing. For us as a foundation, we've also thought about how do we continue to prioritize equity, diversity, and inclusion in ways that will not be in conflict, right, with decisions from the Supreme Court or other changes to the broader legal landscape. And so, some things that companies were doing around setting, things like numeric targets. Those are
Yeah.
not necessarily going to be approaches that are going to work. And so, our goal with companies is to think about, given what's happening, what are the ways that companies can still make good on those commitments and
Yeah.
continue to do the important work that they want to do. But I definitely think there is a degree of a chilling effect, right?
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think a lot even just about the basic idea that, this isn't one and done,
Mhm.
right? And we're talking about behavior shifts, shifts that have to happen across the entire organization that require that sustained commitment in order for it to actually take hold, right? And so, certainly if you're already seeing a waning commitment at the top end, that doesn't bode well for believing that then you're going to get that sort of organizational pull through to really actually start to come back or, shift those numbers meaningfully.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that commitment has to come from the top, and it has to also activate and involve everyone at all levels, whether it's managers or employees. It has to be this like collective collaborative journey that companies are taking. But senior leaders are really, it's really incumbent on senior leaders to be setting that tone and messaging that throughout the organization.
Yeah. One of the companies we work with, I'm sure she won't mind me sharing because they recently actually won an award for a sponsorship program that they were running, and we partnered with them on it at Sounding Board, Cloudera. But they were so intentional about really engaging every level, sponsorship from the high level executives into the program, the leaders that they were trying to bring up the rung or up the ladder. And then also thinking about right level of support. And for them, that did turn into some coaching for actually every end of that, to help them sustain those behaviors and really start to build that into how they showed up, right? How they engaged with their teams. And it was just one, we love seeing it because you see that it actually has real impact. But on the other side, we also see how much intention it takes and how much commitment and work it takes to really deliver and drive these programs at scale.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point and really speaks to your argument that it's not a one and done, right? It's an ongoing effort that has to be driven by that underlying commitment and has to engage employees and stakeholders across the organization in order to be effective and to not just result in people understanding the mission, but also
Yeah.
in like literally changing hearts and minds so that
Yeah.
employees and managers and leaders show up differently in the workplace.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you've seen companies do that have been able to help foster this sort of diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
Yeah, so this year for our company recommendations program,
Yeah.
we spoke with a lot of experts in the field about what they'd seen. And that really shaped, in the report, we kind of highlight some bright spots from different companies of best practices. But, three big things that we know are effective and that we recommend to companies moving forward and that we see, top performing companies doing, are focusing on engaging managers,
Yeah.
focusing on bringing men along on the allyship journey. And in particular, we're really interested in senior level men who make up a lot of leadership, right?
Right. And
Uh,
half the population, right?
exactly. Make up, engaging men, having men not just along for the ride, but spearheading
Yeah.
improvement is not a nice to have. Like it's an absolute essential if we want to actually move the needle on these things. And we found in our work that senior level men tend to have a more like optimistic or rosy view of how things are going for women. And so we talk about like making sure that senior level men like know the data and they know
Yeah.
the progress is slow or the places that it's incomplete, and it's really getting them to like audit the policies and programs that they have so that they are taking the lead and they are messaging across the company what needs to happen. And then the
On that point, Priya, I'll share a story which was so powerful for me personally. At my last company before I started Sounding Board, I distinctly remember this conversation I was having with our CEO, and we were hiring a new executive team member. And, he is a white male. But to his credit, as we were talking about bringing someone in for the role, he said the words, "I don't need another white male around the table," and what just hearing him say that out loud as another female executive around the table
Mhm.
was just so powerful for me. And so, that I just thought I would share that because your story about like we got to get men along really sort of brought that back up to the forefront for me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And saying things like that and that commitment, I mean, that's what can actually drive change.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I think we know this answer already, but with the last minute that we have left, like, is there anything else you can share about why this work is so important to you and maybe something you'd want to leave the audience with?
Yeah. Why is this work important to me? I mean, it's important to me as a woman in the workplace. It's important to me as a mother of a
Mm.
daughter who is going to enter the workforce sometime in the next 15 to 25 years. And it just matters to me as someone who cares like really deeply about everyone having the opportunity to fulfill their potential and to have doors open for them if they work hard. And I always like to kind of end by thinking, well, obviously our foundation is invested in advancing women and making the workplace fairer, and the policies and the programs that we're advocating for will make it better for everyone, right?
Right.
Make it better for men of color, for transgender employees, for anyone who has an identity that has led them to be overlooked or undervalued. And everyone deserves the chance to be able to make their mark the way they want. And so I think that motivation is really at the heart of what we're doing and why we put this report out.
Well, I couldn't agree more. It's a big part of the why for my co-founder and I as well, as two female founders, that we wanted to change the face of leadership. And we thought that really investing in development could be another way to shift that as well. So, well, Priya, thank you so much for the time that you spent with us today. I'm so glad we were able to help share some of this important research that you have been doing at Lean In. And hopefully next year we come back and we get to talk about some new things that have changed.
Yes, hopefully that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And of course, our report is public, so anyone can go to our website and read the whole thing in detail.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And one last thought before you go is we will be having a summit around leader transformation, maybe a great follow up for thinking about how you might be able to invest and build differently in your own programs and corporations. And so putting the details up right here around our leader transformation summit. And then also, as Priya said, go check out their report. It's a really in-depth report, and they talk about so many different themes that I think are really critical to all the work that we're doing today. So thanks again.